The scorching Arizona sun beat down mercilessly as Zara Daniels stumbled through the barren desert. Her once pristine blue dress now torn and filthy, her lips cracked from dehydration. Frederick Porter had been tracking a wounded coyote when he spotted something unusual in the distance, a flash of faded blue fabric against the endless sea of sand and scrub brush. It was 1878, and the West was still wild and unforgiving, especially to a woman alone. Zara had been walking for 2 days now. Maybe 3, she'd lost count as the hours blurred together in a haze of heat and desperation. 5 days earlier, she had left St. Louis with Thomas, her husband of 6 months, bound for California with dreams of a new life. Instead, she'd found herself abandoned in this hellscape, betrayed by the man who'd vowed to protect her until death parted them. "Water," she whispered through parched lips, the word little more than a rasp of air. Her vision swam as the horizon seemed to ripple and dance. Was that a mirage or a man on horseback? Zara didn't have the strength to call out before her legs finally gave way beneath her, and she collapsed onto the baking earth. Frederick spotted her fall from 100 yards away and urged his paint mare, Juniper, into a gallop. Dust billowed behind them as he raced toward the crumpled figure. At 28, Fred had seen his share of death in these unforgiving lands, but something about the sight of this woman alone in the desert made his chest tighten with unusual urgency. He dismounted before Juniper had fully stopped, his boots hitting the ground with a thud as he rushed to the woman's side. Her skin was angry red from sun exposure, her breathing shallow and rapid. Gently, he turned her over, cradling her head. "Madam, can you hear me?" he asked, already reaching for his canteen. Zara's eyelids fluttered, revealing blue eyes clouded with confusion. She flinched away from his touch, a small whimper escaping her throat. "It's all right," Frederick said softly, his voice low and steady like he'd used to calm a spooked horse. "I'm not going to hurt you. You need water." He held the canteen to her lips, tipping it carefully. "Small sips now. Too much too fast will make you sick." Zara coughed as the first drops of water touched her tongue, but then drank eagerly until Frederick pulled the canteen away. "Slow," he reminded her. "What's your name, madam? What are you doing out here alone?" "Zara," she managed, her voice a painful scratch. "Zara Daniels, my husband, Thomas, he—" Her voice broke, whether from physical pain or emotional anguish, Frederick couldn't tell. "Don't try to talk just yet." He glanced around the empty landscape. "Where is your husband now?" Zara's eyes filled with tears that she didn't have the moisture to shed. "Gone. Took the wagon, the money, left me. To die." Frederick's jaw tightened as he absorbed her words. He'd encountered all manner of cruelty in his years as a cowboy and sometimes bounty hunter, but abandoning a woman in the desert struck him as particularly vile. "Well, he didn't succeed, Miss Zara," he said firmly. "And he's not going to. Can you stand?" When she shook her head weakly, Frederick didn't hesitate. He gathered her into his arms, surprised at how light she felt despite her full-length dress. He whistled for Juniper, who obediently stepped closer. "I'm taking you to water, real water," he told her as he carefully mounted his horse with Zara secured in front of him. "There's a settlement about 4 hours' ride from here. You just hold on." Zara leaned against his solid chest, too exhausted to be concerned about propriety. The steady rhythm of the horse's gait and the security of the stranger's arms around her waist lulled her into a state between consciousness and sleep. Frederick kept one arm firmly around her waist, the other holding the reins as they rode toward the small settlement of Copper Creek. His ranch was still another day's ride beyond that, but Copper Creek had a doctor and a hotel where Zara could recover. As they rode, Frederick found himself studying her profile. Even burned by the sun and covered in dust, he could tell she was beautiful. More than that, there was a dignity in the way she held herself, even in her weakened state. He wondered what kind of man could leave a woman like her to die alone in the desert. "Why?" she murmured after they had been riding for nearly an hour. "Why what, Miss Zara?" Frederick asked. "Why did you stop? Most would have ridden past." Frederick considered her question seriously. "My pa taught me that a man's character is shown by what he does when no one's watching. Besides," he added with the ghost of a smile, "I couldn't just leave you there. What kind of story would that make?" A faint smile touched Zara's cracked lips. "I think I'm still waiting for the happy ending to this one." "Well, first things first. Water, food, and rest. Stories can wait their turn." By late afternoon, they reached Copper Creek. The small mining settlement consisted of little more than a general store, a saloon, a modest hotel, and scattered houses, but to Zara, it looked like salvation. Frederick rode directly to the hotel, a two-story wooden building with a wide porch. Mrs. Sullivan, the owner's wife, came rushing out when Frederick carried Zara through the door. A robust woman in her 50s, she took one look at Zara's condition and began barking orders. "Samuel, fetch Dr. Miller. Emily, prepare a bath in room 4 and bring up some of my healing salve." She turned her sharp eyes to Frederick. "Found her in the desert, did you, Mr. Porter?" Frederick nodded, still holding Zara in his arms. "Her husband abandoned her, left her to die." Mrs. Sullivan's face darkened. "Some men don't deserve the air they breathe. Bring her upstairs." "I'll have food sent up once the doctor's seen to her." The next few hours passed in a blur for Zara. Dr. Miller, a kind-faced man with silver at his temples, examined her thoroughly, declaring her severely dehydrated but remarkably resilient. Mrs. Sullivan supervised a lukewarm bath to cool her skin and applied a soothing salve to her sunburns. Clean clothes, a simple cotton nightdress and robe were provided, and Zara was tucked into a real bed for the first time in weeks. Through it all, Frederick Porter waited downstairs, nursing a single whiskey and declining offers to leave. When Mrs. Sullivan finally came down to inform him that Zara was resting comfortably, he nodded with evident relief. "She's asking for you," Mrs. Sullivan added, watching him curiously. "Not sure why, since you're practically strangers, but she's insistent." Frederick set down his glass and stood, straightening his vest. "She's probably just wants to thank me proper. I'll just say a quick good evening and be on my way." Mrs. Sullivan's knowing expression suggested she didn't believe him for a moment, but she merely gestured toward the stairs. Zara was propped up against several pillows when Frederick knocked softly and entered her room. The lamplight cast a warm glow over her clean face, highlighting the delicate structure of her cheekbones and the natural curve of her lips. Her auburn hair, now washed free of dust, hung in damp waves around her shoulders. "Mr. Porter," she said softly, "please sit down." Frederick removed his hat and took the chair beside her bed, suddenly aware of his own dusty appearance. "How are you feeling, Miss Daniels?" "Mrs." she corrected automatically, then paused, her expression troubled. "Though I suppose that's a matter of debate now, and please call me Zara." She looked down at her hands, which were still red and peeling. "I wanted to thank you properly. Dr. Miller says I wouldn't have lasted another day out there." "Anyone would have done the same," Frederick demurred. Zara's gaze met his directly. "No, they wouldn't have." "I've learned that painful lesson." She swallowed hard. "I need to tell you what happened. I need someone to know the truth." Frederick nodded slowly. "I'm listening." Zara's story emerged haltingly at first, then with increasing steadiness as she recounted how she'd met Thomas Daniels in St. Louis, where she'd been working as a seamstress after her parents' death. Thomas had been charming, handsome, and full of grand plans about starting a new life in California. After a whirlwind courtship, They'd married and set out west with their life savings. "We had been traveling for weeks," she continued, her voice steady despite the pain in her eyes. "The journey was harder than I expected, but Thomas kept talking about the beautiful home we would have in Jamestown, California, where his business partner was waiting. Then 3 days ago, we made camp near a small water hole. I woke in the middle of the night to find him packing the wagon." Her voice faltered for the first time. "He said he never wanted a wife, just someone to justify traveling with such a large amount of money without raising suspicions. He took everything, our money, our supplies, even my mother's locket. When I tried to stop him, he—" She touched her cheek, where the faintest shadow of a bruise was still visible beneath her sunburn. Frederick's hands tightened on the brim of his hat. "And he just left you there. No water." "No protection," Zara nodded, her eyes dry but full of a grief that went beyond tears. "He said the desert would take care of the problem. I started walking at first light, hoping to find help." A small, bitter smile touched her lips. "I suppose I should thank him for one thing. He made me realize what a terrible judge of character I've been." "No," Frederick said firmly. "His actions reflect on him, not on you." He hesitated, then asked, "Do you have family somewhere? Someone I can send a telegram to?" Zara shook her head. "No one. My parents died 2 years ago. I have no siblings." She looked up at him with sudden vulnerability. "What happens now?" Frederick hadn't planned beyond bringing her to safety, but seeing her there brave, alone, and yet somehow unbroken stirred something protective in him. "First, you rest and recover," he said decisively. "Mrs. Sullivan says you're welcome to stay here as long as needed. As for after that—" He paused, thinking. "I own a cattle ranch about a day's ride from here. My foreman's wife, Mrs. Abernathy, has been looking for help with housekeeping and cooking for the hands. It's honest work with fair pay if you're interested." Hope flickered in Zara's eyes, quickly tempered by caution. "Why would you do that for a stranger?" Frederick met her gaze steadily. "Because sometimes folks need a second chance. I know I did once upon a time." He stood, settling his hat back on his head. "Think on it. I have business in town for a few days. I'll check on you tomorrow if that's all right." Zara nodded, feeling a curious mixture of gratitude and something else she couldn't quite name. "Thank you, Mr. Porter." "Frederick," he corrected with the hint of a smile, "or Fred to my friends." "Frederick," she repeated softly. "Thank you." After he left, Zara sank deeper into the pillows, exhaustion finally overtaking her. For the first time since waking to find Thomas packing the wagon, she felt a faint glimmer of hope. She had survived the desert. Perhaps she could survive this betrayal as well. Frederick returned to his room at the saloon, his mind filled with thoughts of auburn hair and resilient blue eyes. He'd come to Copper Creek to sell some horses and enjoy a rare break from ranch work, not to rescue a stranded woman or offer her employment. Yet something about Zara Daniels had gotten under his skin in a way he couldn't explain. He pulled out a weathered journal from his saddlebag and began to write, as was his habit each evening. Tonight's entry was longer than usual, filled with descriptions of the woman he'd found in the desert and the strange feeling that their paths crossing might be more significant than chance. Over the next 3 days, Frederick visited Zara daily, bringing small gifts each time: a book of poetry from the general store, a pot of healing salve for her sunburned skin, fresh apples from a local orchard. They talked for hours, sometimes about practical matters like her potential employment at his ranch, sometimes about deeper things like their hopes and disappointments. He learned that Zara was 23, educated by her schoolteacher mother, and had a passion for literature that surprised him. She discovered that beneath Frederick's rugged exterior was a thoughtful man who read philosophy by lamplight and wrote poetry he showed to no one. On the fourth day, Zara was well enough to join Frederick for breakfast in the hotel's small dining room. She wore a simple dress loaned by Mrs. Sullivan, her hair neatly braided and her skin already beginning to heal from its angry red to a more muted pink. "You look better," Frederick observed as he pulled out her chair. "I feel better," Zara replied, settling across from him. "Dr. Miller says I'm recovering remarkably well." Frederick nodded, pleased. "Strong spirit, that makes all the difference sometimes." "I've been thinking about your offer," Zara said after they had ordered coffee and eggs. "The position at your ranch." Frederick tried not to look too eager. "And I'd like to accept if it's still available." She folded her hands carefully on the table. "But I need to be clear about something first. I'm not looking for another husband or protector. I want to earn my own way." Frederick respected the steel in her voice. "The position is legitimate, Zara. Mrs. Abernathy needs the help, and you'll be paid fair wages like any other employee. You'll have your own room in the main house with plenty of privacy and respect." Relief softened her features. "Thank you. When would we leave?" "Tomorrow, if you're strong enough," Frederick replied. "It's a full day's ride to the Flying P. I can arrange for a wagon if you don't feel up to riding horseback." Zara straightened her shoulders. "I can ride. My father taught me as a girl. It's been a while, but I'm sure it will come back to me." Frederick couldn't help but smile at her determination. "I'll bring a gentle mare for you. Be ready at first light," she nodded, and they finished their breakfast, discussing the journey ahead and life at the ranch. Frederick described the Flying P with obvious pride: 20,000 acres of prime grazing land, a solid main house built by his father, and a bunkhouse for the dozen cowboys who worked the cattle. Mrs. Abernathy ran the household with efficiency while her husband, Jack, served as foreman. "It's not fancy," Frederick warned, "but it's a good place. Honest work, good people." "It sounds perfect," Zara said sincerely. The next morning dawned clear and cool, a welcome respite from the recent heat. Frederick waited outside the hotel with 2 horses, his own paint mare, Juniper, and a steady chestnut gelding named Rusty. Zara emerged wearing a riding skirt and blouse that Mrs. Sullivan had altered for her, with a small bundle of possessions tied behind her saddle. "You really can ride," Frederick observed with appreciation as Zara mounted the gelding with practiced ease. "I told you," she replied with a small smile. "My father believed girls should know how to ride and shoot as well as sew and cook." My mother didn't entirely approve, but she didn't stop him either. They set out as the sun crested the eastern mountains, painting the desert in hues of gold and amber. The road to the Flying P took them through varied terrain, rocky outcroppings, stands of pinyon pines, vast stretches of grassland dotted with cattle. Frederick pointed out landmarks and shared stories of the land, while Zara drank in the wild beauty around her. By midday, they stopped to rest the horses and eat the lunch Mrs. Sullivan had packed for them. Seated in the shade of a towering cottonwood beside a small stream, Frederick found himself studying Zara as she unwrapped bread and cheese. "What is it?" she asked, catching his gaze. "Just wondering how you're holding up," he replied. "It's a long ride for someone who was at death's door a few days ago." Zara's smile was genuine. "I'm stronger than I look, Frederick. Always have been." She paused, then added more softly, "And it helps to have something to look forward to rather than run from." The simple honesty of her words touched him. "You know, when I found you in the desert, I thought I was just doing what anyone would do. Now I'm not so sure." "What do you mean?" Frederick struggled to articulate the feeling that had been growing in him since their first meeting. "I think maybe we were supposed to find each other." "Does that sound foolish?" "No," Zara said after a thoughtful pause. "It sounds like faith, something I thought I'd lost." They finished their meal in companionable silence. then continued their journey. As they rode, Zara gradually shared more about her life before Thomas, her childhood in a small Missouri town, her parents' death from influenza, her move to St. Louis in search of work and a fresh start. "I was so naive," she admitted. "When Thomas began courting me, I thought it was like something from a novel, the handsome businessman sweeping the orphaned seamstress off her feet." "You weren't naive," Frederick countered. "You were trusting. There's a difference." "Is there?" "Both lead to the same result when the wrong person comes along." Frederick considered this. "Maybe, but a life without trust isn't much of a life at all." As the afternoon wore on, Zara found herself increasingly drawn to this thoughtful cowboy with his quiet strength and unexpected depth. She caught herself watching the way the sun glinted off his tawny hair, the confident set of his shoulders as he rode, the gentleness in his hands as he tended the horses. It was dangerous, she knew, to feel this way so soon after Thomas's betrayal. And yet, Frederick Porter was nothing like Thomas Daniels. Where Thomas had been all flash and charm, Frederick was substance and steadiness. Where Thomas had made grand promises, Frederick offered simple truths. They reached the Flying P as the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the valley where the ranch was nestled. A substantial two-story house stood on a gentle rise, with a large barn, corral, and bunkhouse arranged nearby. Several cowboys looked up from their evening chores as Frederick and Zara rode in, touching their hats respectfully but clearly curious about the newcomer. A stocky woman with gray-streaked hair, pulled into a severe bun, emerged from the main house, wiping her hands on her apron. Her stern expression softened slightly at the sight of Frederick. "About time you got back, Mr. Porter," she called. "Jack's been wondering if you decided to move to town permanent." "Mrs. Abernathy," Frederick greeted her warmly. "I've brought someone I'd like you to meet. This is Zara Daniels. She's the one I telegraphed you about." Mrs. Abernathy's sharp eyes took in Zara's appearance, from her mending sunburn to her borrowed clothes. Instead of the judgment Zara feared, she saw only practical assessment. "You look half-starved, girl," Mrs. Abernathy declared. "Come inside. Supper's nearly ready, and you can tell me if you know your way around a kitchen while we eat." Frederick hid a smile as he dismounted and helped Zara down, despite her clear ability to manage on her own. "That's Mrs. Abernathy's way of saying welcome," he murmured. "Don't let her intimidate you. Her bark is worse than her bite." "I heard that, Mr. Porter," Mrs. Abernathy called over her shoulder, "and it's not true in the slightest." Zara found herself laughing for the first time in what felt like ages. Perhaps this new beginning would be better than she dared hope. The first weeks at the Flying P settled into a rhythm that Zara found surprisingly comfortable. She woke before dawn each day to help Mrs. Abernathy prepare breakfast for the ranch hands, learned the considerable task of keeping the main house in order, and gradually took over more cooking responsibilities as the older woman tested her abilities. Frederick was often busy with ranch work, but he made time each evening to check on how Zara was settling in. Their conversations on the porch after supper became a highlight of her days, sometimes light and filled with laughter, sometimes deep and philosophical as they discussed books they'd both read or shared stories from their pasts. A month into her stay, Zara was kneading bread dough in the kitchen when Mrs. Abernathy sat down at the table with a cup of coffee, watching her with those sharp eyes that missed nothing. "You're good for him," the older woman said abruptly, Zara's hands stilled in the dough. "I'm sorry." "Mr. Porter, you're good for him." Mrs. Abernathy took a sip of her coffee. "Never seen him talk so much in all the years I've known him, or smile so often." Zara felt her cheeks warm. "We're just friends, Mrs. Abernathy. MMM." The sound conveyed volumes of skepticism. "Well, friend, or whatever you want to call it, you should know that he's a good man. The best I know. Lost his wife and baby girl to childbed fever 6 years ago. Thought he'd never look at another woman again." Zara's heart clenched at this revelation. He never mentioned that. "Would you, if it was your pain?" Mrs. Abernathy set down her cup with a decisive click. "Just thought you should know. Whatever's growing between you two, it's not something he takes lightly." That evening, when Frederick joined her on the porch as usual, Zara found herself seeing him with new eyes, not just as her rescuer or employer, but as a man who had known profound loss and somehow found the strength to continue. "Mrs. Abernathy told me about your wife today," she said softly after they had been sitting in comfortable silence for several minutes. "I'm so sorry, Frederick." His profile stiffened momentarily, then relaxed on a sigh. "Margaret's been threatening to tell you for weeks. Said I was being a coward not mentioning it myself." He turned to look at Zara, his eyes shadowed in the fading light. "She wasn't wrong. You don't owe me your painful memories," Zara said gently. "Don't I?" Frederick's gaze was steady. "You've shared yours with me." Zara considered this. "Fair point. Will you tell me about her? Your wife?" Frederick looked out at the darkening ranch yard, but his eyes were seeing something much further away. "Her name was Elizabeth. We grew up together, always knew we'd marry someday. She was stubborn, funny, kind." A small smile touched his lips. "Terrible cook, though. Nearly poisoned me our first week married." Zara smiled at the fondness in his voice. "She sounds wonderful." She was. He paused, gathering himself. "The pregnancy was difficult from the start. The doctor warned us, but Lizzie was determined. She held our daughter for just 5 minutes before the bleeding couldn't be stopped." His voice grew rougher. "Named her Sarah after my mother. They're buried together on that hill." He nodded toward a rise visible in the moonlight, where a single oak tree stood sentinel. Without thinking, Zara reached over and placed her hand over his. "Thank you for telling me." Frederick looked down at their hands, then slowly turned his palm up to clasp hers. "For a long time, I thought that part of my life was over for good, that I'd had my chance at that kind of happiness." His eyes met hers, vulnerable yet determined. "I don't think that anymore." The simple statement hung between them, full of unspoken meaning. Zara's heart thundered in her chest. It was too soon, she knew. She was still healing from Thomas's betrayal, still finding her footing in this new life. And yet the connection between them was undeniable. "I'm not ready," she whispered honestly. "Not yet, but I think someday I could be." Frederick's fingers tightened around hers. "I can wait," he said simply. "For as long as you need." The following months brought changes to the Flying P. Autumn arrived, painting the surrounding hills in russet and gold. The cattle were rounded up and some driven to market, bringing a welcome influx of cash that Frederick immediately invested back into the ranch, repairs to the barn roof, new tools, warm blankets for the coming winter. Zara's role expanded beyond the household as she proved her competence. She began keeping the ranch's books, discovering a talent for figures that Frederick immediately valued. When a visiting horse trader commented with surprise on a woman doing a man's job, Frederick's firm reply, "Miss Daniels does the job because she's the best at it, not because of what she is or isn't," warmed her heart for days afterward. Their relationship evolved in small, significant ways. A brush of hands when passing a ledger book, a private smile shared across a crowded room during the harvest dance in town. Long rides together on Sunday afternoons, ostensibly to check fence lines but really to enjoy each other's company away from curious eyes. By December, when the first snow dusted the higher pastures, Zara realized with quiet certainty that she had fallen in love with Frederick Porter. The realization didn't come as a lightning strike, but as a gentle dawn, the natural conclusion to months of growing admiration, respect, and affection. Still, she hesitated to speak of it, cautious after her disastrous marriage to Thomas. Frederick, true to his word, waited patiently, never pushing but making his own feelings clear in 100 small ways, the fresh wildflowers that appeared on her nightstand, the rare books he ordered from Denver that matched her literary tastes, the way his eyes followed her movements when he thought she wasn't looking. Christmas approached, bringing with it preparations that kept the entire ranch busy. Mrs. Abernathy orchestrated an elaborate feast, while Frederick arranged for small gifts for every hand, and a special celebration on Christmas Eve. The night before Christmas, after the hands had retired to the bunkhouse with their gifts of tobacco and new gloves, Frederick asked Zara to join him for a walk despite the cold. "I have something I want to show you," he explained, helping her into her coat. They walked through the crisp night air, their breath forming clouds in the moonlight. Frederick led her to the barn, where he lit a lantern and guided her to a corner normally used for storage. There, covered with a canvas tarp, stood something large and rectangular. "What is this?" Zara asked, intrigued. Frederick looked suddenly nervous, a rare expression for him. "Your Christmas gift, though it's as much for me as for you, I suppose." He pulled away the tarp to reveal a beautiful oak desk, its surface polished to a high shine. The piece was clearly handmade, with intricate carvings along the edges and perfectly fitted drawers. "Frederick," Zara breathed, running her fingers over the smooth wood. "It's beautiful. Did you make this?" He nodded, looking pleased by her reaction. "Been working on it for months, whenever I could slip away. Thought you might like a proper place to work on the books instead of the kitchen table." "I love it," she said sincerely. Then she noticed something unusual about the desk, a small brass plate affixed to the center drawer. Leaning closer, she read the inscription, ZDP. "ZDP?" she questioned, looking up at Frederick with confusion. His expression was solemn now, his eyes intent on hers. "Zara Daniels Porter," he said quietly. "If you want it to be," understanding dawned. "Frederick." He took her hands in his touch gentle but sure. "I love you, Zara. I think I started falling the moment I found you in that desert, though I was too stubborn to admit it then. These past months, watching you rebuild your life, seeing your strength and kindness every day, I know now that finding you was the greatest blessing of my life." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a simple gold ring with a small pearl set in its center. "This was my mother's. I'd be honored if you'd wear it as my wife, but only if you're ready, only if you're sure." Zara looked from the ring to Frederick's face, seeing in his eyes all the love and respect she'd once thought impossible to find. The wounds Thomas had inflicted were still there, but they had healed into scars that made her stronger, wiser. "Yes," she said, her voice steady with certainty. "Yes, Frederick Porter, I will marry you." His smile was like sunrise breaking over the mountains as he slipped the ring onto her finger. When he kissed her, Zara felt as though she had finally, truly found water after a lifetime in the desert. They were married on New Year's Day, 1879, in the ranch house parlor, with Mrs. Abernathy sniffling into her handkerchief and Jack Abernathy standing as best man. The ranch hands filled the room to capacity, all wearing their Sunday best and grinning widely at the happiness so evident on their boss's face. Zara wore a dress of deep blue velvet, ordered specially from Denver, with her mother's cameo at her throat, a piece she'd feared lost forever, until Frederick had surprised her by presenting it to her the night before the wedding. "How?" she had gasped, touching the precious keepsake with trembling fingers. "I had some connections look for Thomas Daniels," Frederick explained. Found him in a gambling hall in San Francisco trying to pawn this. Seems he lost most of your money at the tables already." His expression had darkened briefly. "He won't be bothering you again." Zara hadn't asked for details, trusting that Frederick had handled the matter with the same quiet integrity he brought to everything. The cameo was returned, justice, in its way, was served. The past was finally behind her. As they exchanged vows before the local minister, Zara looked into Frederick's steady eyes and felt the desert of her past recede completely. Where once there had been only scorching emptiness, now there was abundance, love, respect, partnership, and the promise of a future rich with possibility. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the minister declared, and the room erupted in cheers as Frederick kissed his bride. The celebration lasted well into the night, with music from Jack Abernathy's fiddle, dancing in the cleared space of the main room, and enough food to feed twice their number. When Frederick finally swept Zara away to the privacy of what was now their shared bedroom, she went willingly, her heart full and her spirit at peace. Spring came early that year, bringing with it new calves, wildflowers carpeting the lower pastures, and the news that Zara was expecting their first child. Frederick's joy was tempered with fear, given his past loss, but Zara's quiet confidence gradually eased his concerns. "This child will be born healthy and strong," she assured him one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, his hand resting protectively over her still flat stomach. "I can feel it." The pregnancy progressed smoothly through the summer and into fall. Frederick hired additional help for the house, insisting that Zara rest more as her time approached. She complied with his protective measures even as she continued to keep the ranch books and help with the lighter household duties. On a crisp October morning, after a labor that was long but ultimately uncomplicated, Zara gave birth to a son. Frederick, who had paced the hallway for hours despite Mrs. Abernathy's insistence that men had no place in a birthing room, was finally allowed inside to meet his child. He approached the bed with reverence, his eyes fixed on the small bundle in Zara's arms. "We have a son," she said, her voice tired but triumphant as she lifted the blanket to show his tiny face. Frederick sat carefully beside her, one finger gently tracing the perfect curve of his son's cheek. "He's beautiful," he whispered, "just like his mother." "I thought we might call him James," Zara suggested. "After your father." Frederick's eyes glistened as he nodded. "James Porter, it's a good name, a strong name." He leaned down to kiss Zara's forehead, then the top of his son's downy head. "Thank you," he said simply. "For what?" Zara asked, smiling up at him. "For finding your way to me, for trusting me enough to build this life together." His voice roughened with emotion. "For our son." "I should be thanking you," Zara countered softly. "You saved my life, Frederick." "In more ways than one." He shook his head, his expression serious. "No, you saved yourself. I just brought you to water." As if understanding the significance of the moment, baby James opened his eyes blue like his mother's and regarded his parents with solemn curiosity, before yawning widely and settling back to sleep. Life at the Flying P took on new rhythms with a child in the house. James grew into a sturdy, curious toddler who delighted in following his father around the ranch and sitting in his mother's lap as she worked at her oak desk. Mrs. Abernathy, who had initially claimed to be too old to be fussing over babies, proved to be a doting surrogate grandmother who spoiled the boy shamelessly. The ranch prospered under Frederick and Zara's joint management. With careful planning and Zara's keen eye for numbers, they expanded their holdings, built a larger barn, and established a reputation for the quality of their cattle that brought buyers from as far away as Chicago. 2 years after James's birth, Zara gave birth to twin girls, Elizabeth and Sarah, named for the women whose absence had once left such a void in Frederick's life. He wept openly when Zara suggested the names, then held his daughters with a tenderness that made her fall in love with him all over again. As the children grew, so too did the legend of their parents' beginning. The hands told new cowboys the story of how the boss had found Mrs. Porter dying in the desert, abandoned by her first husband, and how he'd brought her back to the Flying P and eventually won her heart. The story grew with each telling, sometimes making Frederick into a heroic figure who had fought off bandits or wild animals to rescue his future wife. Zara would listen to these embellished versions with amused tolerance, but when her children asked for the true story, she told it plainly. How she had made a mistake in trusting the wrong man, how the desert had nearly claimed her life, and how a good man with a kind heart had found her and brought her to water. "And then you fell in love?" 10-year-old Elizabeth would ask dreamily. "Not right away," Zara would explain. "First came respect, then friendship, and then, when I was ready, love. Real love isn't like in storybooks, sweetheart. It's built day by day, choice by choice." On their 15th wedding anniversary, Frederick surprised Zara with a special gift, a journey back to the exact spot where he had found her in the desert. Now a prosperous rancher with significant holdings, he arranged for their children to stay with the Abernathys while he and Zara made the 2-day trip. They arrived at sunset, the slanting light painting the landscape in gold and amber, much as it had been that fateful day. Frederick spread a blanket on the ground, and they sat together looking out over the vast expanse that had once seemed so hostile. "It doesn't seem as frightening now," Zara observed, leaning against her husband's solid shoulder. "Nothing seems as frightening with you beside me," Frederick replied, his arm tightening around her waist. Zara turned to study his face, still handsome at 43, though now lined at the eyes and gray at the temples. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't been tracking that coyote that day? If our paths hadn't crossed?" Frederick considered the question seriously, as was his way. "I think we would have found each other somehow," he said finally. "Maybe not here, maybe not then, but somehow. Some connections are just meant to be." Zara smiled, touching the weathered skin of his cheek. The romantic cowboy poet emerges again. "Only for you," he said, capturing her hand and pressing a kiss to her palm. "Always only for you." As the sun sank below the horizon, painting the sky in deepening shades of purple and crimson, Zara reflected on the journey that had brought her here, not just the physical journey through the desert, but the emotional one from betrayal to trust, from abandonment to belonging. Thomas Daniels had left her in the desert to die, thinking her a problem to be discarded. Instead, she had found strength she never knew she possessed, a partner who valued her mind as much as her heart, and a life richer than any she could have imagined in those dark days. "What are you thinking about?" Frederick asked, noticing her introspective expression. "That sometimes the worst thing that happens to you can lead to the best," she replied honestly. "If Thomas hadn't abandoned me here, I never would have found you or the Flying P or our children or the woman I've become." Frederick nodded his understanding. "From death, life. From despair, hope." He smiled, the same gentle smile that had first won her trust all those years ago. "From the desert, the most precious water." As darkness fell around them, they remained together beneath the vast canopy of stars, two people who had found in each other not just love, but home, the surest water in a sometimes barren world. Over the following years, the Porter family continued to thrive. James followed in his father's footsteps, learning the cattle business from the ground up and eventually taking over much of the ranch's day-to-day management. Elizabeth, with her mother's head for figures, attended one of the first colleges to accept women, and returned with modern business practices that expanded the flying Ptah's prosperity even further. Sarah, the more artistic of the twins, became a skilled photographer whose images of ranch life were published in newspapers as far away as New York. The Porters weathered the changing times, the arrival of the railroad that transformed cattle shipping, the increasing settlement of the once wild territories, the gradual transition from frontier to civilization. Through it all, Frederick and Zara remained constants for each other, their partnership deepening with each passing year. When Frederick's hair had turned completely silver and Zara's auburn was streaked with gray, they would still often sit together on the porch in the evening, watching the sunset much as they had in those early days. Sometimes they spoke of the future, their grandchildren's prospects, the changes coming to the ranch, the new century on the horizon. Sometimes they reminisced about the past, the early struggles, the joy of their children's births, the challenges they had overcome together. But always, when the conversation lulled into comfortable silence, Frederick would reach for Zara's hand, his touch as reassuring as it had been that first day when he had found her collapsed in the desert and promised to bring her to water. And Zara, feeling the familiar warmth of his calloused palm against hers, would know with absolute certainty that she had found not just water, but an entire ocean of love, boundless, deep, and enduring through all seasons of their life together.